I'm not entirely sure who came up with the plan, but by the end of the day, we had settled on the destination and the date. Although I'd been camping many times before, I was fairly certain neither Sam nor Danny had. They had come into the family later, after my real father had passed away. He was the one who had loved camping. My stepfather, however, wasn't as keen on the outdoors. Don't get me wrong, he's a wonderful man, but nature was never his thing. We made a detailed list of all the supplies we needed for the trip and followed it precisely, including the 4 cases of beer, which might have been the most important item. Everything was packed and ready for us to leave at sunrise the next day. As we set off, none of us could have imagined what was ahead of us or how it would change the bond between us. Something we had once thought to be unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was quiet and uneventful. I was happy to see how dry the area was. While making a fire wasn't a problem for me, I knew it wasn't exactly a strength of mine. Plus, I knew neither of my brothers had experience with anything beyond lighting a cigarette. Just to be safe, I brought along some lighter fluid, though I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Sam and Danny, using some skills they had picked up from YouTube, struggled with setting up the tent. I had chosen the simplest tent I could find, yet it still took them nearly an hour. By the time they joined me, the fire was roaring. I had buried the potatoes in the coals and prepped the steaks, already well into my second beer by then. The steaks were cooked quickly, and by the time it was dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping experience began. I had deliberately chosen a remote location because I knew we'd get loud and obnoxious once we got drunk, and I liked making big bonfires and playing my music loud. You can't do that with other campers nearby. That evening turned out to be a blast. We went through 2 cases of beer and didn't crash until dawn. It was something I'd needed for a long time, and despite the hangover, I made up my mind that we were going to do this more often. By the time I dragged myself out of my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Sam and Danny were already awake, sitting by the dead fire with beers in hand. They looked pleased to see me. I asked what had happened to the fire, and Sam mumbled something about not being able to get it going, which made me laugh. I grabbed an armful of wood from the tree line and dropped it onto the cold coals, blowing on them until they flared up. Within minutes, the fire was roaring again. I went to the stream to fetch some water, and when I got back, Sam's jaw had dropped, and Danny looked like he was dying to ask how I did it. As I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a big mess of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with some coffee. After eating, I felt much better and suggested we go fishing. We didn't return to camp until almost dark, and unfortunately, none of us had caught anything worth keeping. But Sam had clearly caught a good buzz. I grilled the leftover steak, and we set to finishing what remained of the beer. This night was much quieter than the last. I didn't want to build a big fire, knowing it would be harder to fully extinguish before we headed home. We spent most of the night talking about random stuff, work, girls. Around 2 a.m., we decided to turn in. The beer was long gone, and my last memory was Sam heading out of the tent to relieve himself. He'd had way more to drink than Danny or I, and I remember him stumbling a few times trying to get out of his sleeping bag. He eventually made it out, and I must have passed out shortly after. The next thing I remember, the sun was starting to peek through the trees, and I had to pee. I unzipped the tent carefully, trying not to wake the others. As soon as I opened the tent, I was hit by a strange, burning smell, like charred meat. I figured one of the guys was already up and trying to cook breakfast. Looking back, only Danny was still asleep, so I assumed Sam was the one at the fire. I crawled out, expecting to tease Sam about his cooking, but what I saw was far more shocking. The fire had gone out, and Sam was nowhere to be seen. The light was still dim, but there was a large, unmoving object lying across the dead coals. I walked closer and was hit full force by the burning smell. That's when I realized what I was looking at: Sam, lying face down in the remnants of the fire. He wasn't moving. Without thinking, I grabbed him and rolled him over. His skin was blackened, and the smell was overwhelming. I started yelling for Danny, but when he didn't respond right away, I ran back to the tent and shook him awake. He resisted at first, but when I shouted that Sam was dead, he bolted upright and demanded I repeat myself. All I could do was point toward the fire and the horrible scene that was becoming clearer with the rising sun. Danny flew out of the tent and almost came face to face with Sam's charred body that I stood behind him, silent, my eyes closed. Danny collapsed to his knees and started wailing. In that moment, I wished I could be anywhere else. The combination of the smell and the sound of Danny's sobs was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. A cold breeze hit me, and that's when I realized I had wet myself. It didn't matter. I couldn't bear to open my eyes and see Sam like that again. That I crawled back into the tent and started crying. And I stayed there for who knows how long until I finally decided I should call for help. The authorities arrived about an hour and a half later. When the coroner took Sam's body away, I finally gathered the strength to come back out. Danny was speaking with one of the officers, and the smell was still so strong that I started retching and went back inside the tent. Another officer joined me inside the tent, and we talked about the trip and the events of the night before, though nothing significant stood out. He left about 20 minutes later, and the remaining officers soon followed. Danny and I began breaking down camp in silence. I worked quickly, desperate to get away from the awful stench of my brother's burned flesh. Looking back, I might have seemed cold and uncaring, but I was the oldest, and it was my responsibility to inform the rest of the family. I knew telling our mother would be devastating, and I wanted to do it before she heard it from anyone else. Mom had always dreamed of a big family, and when my father died, she thought that dream was over. But when she met my stepfather and they discussed adoption, she was thrilled. Sam and Danny were biological brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens when she adopted them. Older kids are usually harder to adopt, but she had fallen in love with them immediately. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of our family. That I in the weeks following Sam's death, I started noticing that Danny seemed suspicious of me. He didn't say anything outright, but I caught him giving me strange looks more than once. As more and more questions about Sam's death arose, I began to wonder what had really happened that night. I had always assumed Sam had either passed out or tripped and fallen into the fire. He was far more intoxicated than we were. But when the medical examiner's report came back, some things didn't add up. For example, Sam's back was covered in bruises, which could be explained by the fact that he had played rugby for years. But his skull was also fractured, a worrying sign. Though the doctors admitted it could have happened due to the fire, as extreme heat can cause a skull to crack, it still raised doubts in Danny's mind. He seemed convinced that I had something to do with Sam's death. I, too, had my own suspicions about Danny's relationship with Sam. I'd seen them argue more than once, only for them to stop as soon as I entered the room. But now wasn't the time for the family to fall apart. Our mother needed us more than ever. If she sensed the growing distrust between us, it would break her heart, maybe even destroy her. For now, I'm determined to bring us back together, for Mom's sake, and perhaps for Sam's too. I'll keep digging into what really happened between the two brothers that night, even if it leads to an awful truth none of us want to face. After all, Sam was my brother too. I owe it to him. Growing up wasn't easy. Instead of constant physical harm, although that did happen, it was mostly my parents ignoring me. They both had problems with drinking. My mom worked part-time, claiming she wanted to be around for me, but in reality, she spent most of her time either passed out or drinking. My dad, who was a long-haul trucker, was barely ever home, leaving me to fend for myself. We lived in a small house on the outskirts of a town, with a huge forest stretching out behind it. From as early as I can remember, I was captivated by those woods. Before long, I spent most of my days exploring them, finding peace there. I realized pretty quickly that neither of my parents noticed when I came or went, so I started staying out in the forest overnight, just to see if they'd miss me. Of course, they didn't. Soon, I was spending weeks camping out deep in the woods. But all good things eventually end, and one morning, after a long stretch of being away, my dad caught me sneaking back home. He had just returned from a trip, and it was early, around 5 a.m. on a school day. When he saw his 13-year-old son walking out of the woods, he was furious. He punished me, and I got yelled at by both of them. But that didn't stop me from going back. After laying low for a while, I waited until my dad was gone and my mom was drunk again. Once she was out, I slipped back into the forest. Every morning, I'd sneak back into the house before school without being noticed. My life went back to how it was. If I wasn't in school, I was wandering the woods. I had a few spots where I'd camp. Early on, I figured out I wasn't the only one who had found refuge there. Homeless people would camp there, drinking and staying away from the public eye. One time, I made the mistake of staying in the same place for too long and was almost attacked by one of them. After that, I moved my camps across the river, away from them. Some nights, I would watch them from the shadows as they drank and fought. Seeing their destruction only deepened my resentment. It reminded me too much of what I had to deal with at home. As time went on, I moved further into the forest, always searching for new places to explore. By summer, more homeless people had arrived. They set up their camps throughout the woods, but I stayed safe by keeping to my side of the river, which only I knew how to cross easily. One sweltering summer day, while getting water from the river, I heard voices in the distance. I kept my guard up. After filling my canteen, I was heading back when I saw a group arguing on the other side. I hid to watch. There was a makeshift tent, and next to it, 3 men and a woman were shouting at each other. They were too far away for me to hear everything clearly, but they were clearly drunk, flailing their arms as they yelled. I stayed hidden for about 10 minutes just watching. Then, one of the men smashed a bottle over another man's head. The guy fell and didn't move. Then, the first man picked up a large rock and slammed it into the man's head over and over. The others just stood there watching. He did it 3 times before he was too tired to continue. I had to hold in my screams, terrified and unable to move. The woman screamed something and slapped the man who had done it, but he just stood there, staring at the body. After a few minutes, they all ran off. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too scared to move in case they came back. Eventually, I convinced myself they weren't returning. I expected the man on the ground to get up, but he didn't. For some reason, I thought I needed to help him. Even though he was just a homeless drunk, he was still human. I sprinted the 3 miles back home. When I got there, I was relieved to see my dad was home. I ran inside, breathless, and shouted for my parents. They were sitting on the couch, and I started telling them what I'd seen. My dad snapped at me to shut up, then asked what had happened. When I told him, instead of helping, he started yelling at me for being out in the woods. My mom, slurring her words, joined in, and they both tore into me. The worst part was when my mom accused me of making it all up for attention. I denied it, but she wouldn't listen. The conversation ended the way it always did, with my dad pulling off his belt and hitting me until I cried. I cried myself to sleep that night, like so many nights before. Afterward, I wasn't allowed out of the house without one of my parents, so my time in the woods was over. Not long after, they sent me to live with my grandfather, saying they couldn't handle me anymore. I expected life to be worse there, thinking maybe my mother's issues had come from him, but I was wrong. Grandpa Joe turned out to be the most kind and patient man I'd ever met. He was the first adult to ever ask me what I liked to do. No one had ever cared to know. I nervously told him about my love for nature, expecting him to laugh, but instead, his eyes lit up. He spent the next hour telling me stories about his own camping trips. I realized then how lucky I was. As soon as spring came, we spent all our time hiking and exploring different parks and forests. Grandpa Joe taught me everything he knew about nature, and that knowledge has shaped my life. Even though he's too old now to go hiking with me, I still visit him and tell him all about my adventures. His body might be frail, but his mind is as sharp as ever. I owe him more than I could ever repay, just for loving me. Took me years to finally tell him the story about the woods. I also told him how guilty I felt for not saying anything sooner. He hugged me, and when I asked him what I should do, he told me to contact the police. He said once I told them, it wasn't my burden anymore. So I did, and the weight of that guilt lifted. Years later, while I was in college, Grandpa Joe told me the police had found the people responsible. Most of them had died, but the woman had led the detectives to the man's body. They thanked me for helping solve the case after all that time. With that, I put that dark chapter behind me until recently when my dad died, bringing all those memories back. But now, as an adult, I see things more clearly. My love for the wilderness has become my career, traveling the world to protect the natural places I once escaped to. Without Grandpa Joe, none of this would have been possible. In the summer months, from late June to early August, a camp in the northeastern U.S. comes to life. It's a sleepaway camp, with staff and kids arriving every Sunday afternoon and leaving Friday night. Throughout the week, everyone stays in cabins scattered around the grounds, cut off from the outside world. The camp spans several acres and includes a large dining hall, various other buildings, and vast stretches of beautiful natural scenery. There are open fields, forests, a large pond filled with fish, and a stunning ravine. The property feels completely isolated, hidden away from any major roads with only a long, private driveway leading in. Technology is largely banned for campers, while staff can only use devices during breaks. No computers, no cars, and limited communication with the outside world. The staff relies on walkie-talkies to stay connected across the sprawling campgrounds. I spent a decade there as a camper and worked as staff for 4 more years. This place holds a special spot in my heart, but it also has a long history of strange and unexplained events. I could fill a book with all the eerie stories I've heard and personally experienced during those summers. I'd like to give you a glimpse into what it's like as a staff member and share some of the more chilling encounters I had between 2014 and 2018, during the time I worked as a counselor, aged 16 to 20. Most of the strange events occurred at night, especially during training week, and generally affected the camp staff more than the campers. Campers rarely came into contact with the odd occurrences, and I can't explain why. As a child, I never felt scared there. But as an adult, some experiences left me on edge. During training week or after the campers went to sleep, counselors often relaxed outside the dining hall, gazing up at the stars. We had an open view of the sky, which allowed us to spot strange lights moving in odd patterns. Unexplained flashes, unexpected meteor showers, and mysterious red lights would appear in the sky. Some of the older counselors, who knew a lot about astronomy, were often baffled by what we saw. Nightmares were common among the staff. Many had recurring dreams of figures standing at the foot of their beds or lurking in the corners of their cabins. I had such dreams almost every summer, waking up in a sweat, only to find the cabin silent and the campers peacefully asleep. Other common occurrences included hearing voices and footsteps in the night, items disappearing and reappearing in strange places, and doors mysteriously unlocking. Counselors often arrived as skeptics but left believing there was something unexplainable about the Camp. My first encounter with the paranormal was in 2014, my first year as a counselor. There was an old, flat gravestone near the pool, just outside the girls' cabins. It was so worn that the name and dates were unreadable, but it was clear it marked a grave. No one knew how long it had been there or why. By the end of that summer, the gravestone had been removed, and we were told not to talk about it. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still buried there, and removing the stone didn't stop the strange happenings. The older staff told stories of two famous ghosts. One was a boy seen running across the camp's recreation field. The legend went that he had been hit by a car while chasing a ball and now haunted the camp. The second was a woman in white, who could be seen standing on the porch of a house near the camp, staring toward the camp at night before disappearing by morning. Though those stories frightened us, a more experienced counselor later showed me the shadows that made the boy and woman look real. An electrical box's shadow resembled a small child, and a large American flag looked like a woman in the breeze. While these were just illusions, there were other things at camp that weren't so easily explained. One of the most unsettling places at camp was an old building called Day Camp. It used to be a house, and it stood alone, separated from the other camp buildings by a stretch of woods. The building gave off a deeply unnerving feeling. Whenever I was inside, it felt as though someone or something was always watching me. The building was far from the main part of the camp, and at night, its dark wooden exterior blended into the forest. Sometimes, after the day campers left, the building would be closed and locked, but later that night, the lights inside would be found on again, even though no one had been in there. More than once, counselors had to walk through the dark woods to turn the lights off, swearing they'd never do it again. In 2016, I had an especially creepy experience during a missing camper drill, which was done to practice locating a child if one ever ran away. During the drill, I was assigned to check the day camp building. As I walked through the silent rooms, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. After searching the building and finding nothing, I headed back outside. Just as I passed the cellar doors, I saw that they were wide open, with a light shining from inside. A place I didn't even know had a light. That night, a friend had a similarly eerie experience at another part of camp, where a door rattled violently even though no one was inside. In 2017, I was promoted to a program specialist and ended up running activities in day camp again. This time, I had a close friend with me who was sensitive to paranormal activity. He confirmed my suspicions about the building, but reassured me that the spirits there weren't harmful. Over time, I grew more comfortable in day camp, though I could never fully relax. Though there are many more stories I could share, I'll stop here for now. Despite the strange happenings, nothing at the camp ever tried to hurt us. The spirits seemed to just want to be remembered and talked about. The camp is full of history, and I believe the spirits are simply a part of its identity. This place has seen generations of campers, and I'm certain that's why it holds onto so much energy. Though eerie, I respect the mysteries of that camp, and those who visit it quickly learn to do the same. The arguments always began the same way. You'll never catch me dead in a national park filled with nothing but overweight tourists in RVs from the new generation, and I like it just the way it is. Referring to him as old-fashioned was putting it mildly. If it wasn't made of canvas or leather, he deemed it modern junk. My mom tried several times to introduce things like nylon tents, but he refused. He'd rather lug around that giant, musty wall tent everywhere we camped. And don't even get me started on the leaky cans of kerosene that spilled over everything. He was definitely a man born in the wrong era. The term roughing it could have been invented for him. We endured his outdated way of enjoying nature until my younger brother's near-death experience changed his mind. Throughout the early 80s, my dad would take us to the National Forest during Thanksgiving. The weather was mild for that time of year, and the woods were beautiful. I can still smell the pine trees. These trips always seemed to line up with hunting season for some reason. I recall hearing that Dad used to hunt before he met Mom, I think she had forbidden him from doing it anymore. Maybe this was his way of rebelling against her. Either way, gunshots near our camp became a normal sound. Our parents grew up with little supervision, so it didn't seem unusual to let my brother Mike and me roam the woods by ourselves. No one thought it might be dangerous to have two boys playing in the forest with so many hunters around. We'd leave camp at dawn, play until lunchtime, and head back out until dinner. We'd been doing this for as long as I could remember, and no one thought twice about it. One particular Thanksgiving, we'd been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was when G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were super popular, and Mike and I loved dressing up in camouflage and playing war. Mike's birthday had been a few days earlier, and he had just gotten a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were cheap, but we adored them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't recall exactly what I was doing, but I knew Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree when suddenly I heard a loud bang, followed by a whistling sound near my head. I dropped flat to the ground, unsure of what was happening. Something told me to stay still. About 30 seconds later, I heard faint moaning in the distance. Mike was nowhere in sight, so I called him on the walkie-talkie, no answer. Then I heard what sounded like my name. I called again, but still no response. Now I was getting scared. Unsure of what to do, I yelled out that the game was over and he needed to answer me. I didn't know if he was still trying to prank me or if something was seriously wrong. I listened carefully, but only heard the faint rustling of leaves. I walked toward the sound, but when I called out again, all I heard was another moan. I ran about 20 yards and stopped. The rustling came again, this time much closer. I dropped to my stomach and scanned the ground. About 3 feet away, I saw the bottom of a shoe. It had to be Mike's. I rushed over, and the sight that met me still haunts me to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with fear in his eyes. Just under his arm, there was a gaping wound with blood pouring out. I was in shock but did my best to stay calm. I didn't want to scare him more than he already was. Had I been older, I might have known better how to move him, but I just picked him up and carried him as far as I could. He was too heavy for me, but I was determined to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had to set him down. Mike must have been in terrible pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice was so weak, I nearly broke down. Somehow, I held it together and ran all the way back to camp. Mom must have sensed something was wrong because she immediately called for Dad. He rushed out, took one look at me, and asked, "How bad is it?" I was too out of breath to speak, so I just pointed in the direction where I had left Mike. Dad took off running. By the time I caught up, Dad was already carrying Mike back to camp. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Mom kept talking to Mike, urging him to hang on. I sat in the back, pressing my shirt against the wound. What normally would have been a 30-minute drive took us just under 20. Dad handed Mike off to the doctors, who rushed him into surgery within the hour. The next few hours felt like a living nightmare. I was in shock over what had happened, but I was amazed at how calm my parents seemed. Now that I'm a parent myself, I realize they were far from calm. They were just handling the situation as best they could. It was after midnight when the doctor finally came to give us an update. Mike had been in critical condition for a while and had technically died more than once during surgery, but he now had a good chance of fully recovering. The police arrived the next morning to question us. I broke down several times while recounting the events. That was the first time I really grasped how close I had come to being shot as well. Mike stayed in the hospital for a few weeks, and my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think Dad considered staying at the campsite, but after a brief conversation with Mom, he decided against it. The detectives kept us updated, but even by the time Mike was discharged, no one had been connected to the shooting. The leading theory was that a poacher had mistaken Mike's movement for a deer. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Mike made a full recovery and eventually went on to build his own business and family. Something good did come from that terrible event. We never went back to the national forest. Even better, Dad realized that camping with all those tourists in RVs was a safer option for our family. Between the ages of 12 and 17, I spent holidays in places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. That's the kind of camping I always envisioned, peaceful and quiet, and I'm pretty sure Mike would agree. This was around 2002 when an old buddy of mine invited me to join him for a camping trip. I hadn't been camping since I was about 14, so I agreed, excited by the idea. The entire week leading up to it, I could barely sleep from the anticipation. My friend picked me up a little after 5 a.m., and we drove nearly 90 miles to the park. I managed to catch some sleep on the way, so I felt a bit more energized when we arrived. That's when my friend dropped the news on me. We still had to hike 2 more hours to reach the campsite. I tried to persuade him to pick one that was closer, but he insisted I would love the spot once we got there. Reluctantly, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't too bad. Most of it was downhill, but as time passed, I started feeling more and more exhausted. Halfway there, we took a short break, but soon enough, we were back on the trail. The second half was much tougher, mostly uphill, and before long I was dragging my feet and losing focus. When we finally reached a flat area, I felt relieved. My friend, who was ahead, somehow missed the trap, but I didn't. One moment I was walking, and the next I was on the ground. Hitting the bottom of the pit shocked me awake, and a rush of adrenaline masked most of the pain. When I tried to stand, my right leg gave way, and I collapsed onto a sharpened stick sticking up from the ground. There were more stakes at the bottom, but luckily, they had been knocked over. When I glanced down, I saw the bone in my shin sticking out. Instinctively, I pulled the stick out of my leg, which only intensified the pain, leaving me more nauseated than before. I looked up and saw nothing but blue sky bordered by trees. The pit seemed about 8 feet deep, and I couldn't help but think the fools who dug it must have spent days working on it. I shouted for my friend, and soon enough, his laughing face appeared above me. He didn't know how bad my injury was at first, but when I told him, the laughter turned into panic. I asked him what had happened, and he said it looked like some hunters had dug a pit trap, and I had fallen into it. I assumed he could just reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. Next, he tried to extend a tree branch down to me. It worked for a moment, but when I tried to stand, the pain was unbearable. There was no way I could put weight on my right leg. It became clear that I wasn't getting out without help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't too worried. I could hear my friend pacing above me, clearly freaking out. Trying to stay calm, I told him to go get help from the ranger station, which was about an hour's walk from where we had come. He could easily make it back before dark. After he left, I was alone with nothing but the pain. Waves of it came over me, and the nausea didn't make things any easier. At one point, I thought about trying to make a splint, but when I attempted to tighten it, I almost passed out. I decided it was best to leave it alone and sat with my head between my knees until the dizziness subsided. After a while, I tried to distract myself by singing, but that only worked for a bit. Then I heard thunder and noticed the sky above growing darker. I figured a little rain wouldn't hurt, but I should have considered the situation more carefully. At first, the rain was light, but soon, it was pouring down in sheets. I was fine until I noticed water starting to fill the pit. My feet were already submerged before I realized the trouble I was in. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, as best as I could manage, and prayed the rain would stop. As the minutes dragged on, more of my body disappeared into the rising water. After about an hour, the storm finally eased up, and I could relax a little. The water had only reached halfway up to my shins, and I figured if it kept up at that rate, help would arrive before the water got any higher. Unfortunately, the rain soon returned with a vengeance. On the bright side, the rain took my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to stay positive by thinking of funny movies and jokes. The next hour felt like the longest of my life. By the time help finally arrived, the rain had almost stopped. The ropes they lowered down pulled me out just as the water reached just below my waist. The thought of nearly drowning in a small pit in the middle of nowhere still haunts me. Once I was out, the ride to the hospital went by quickly. After surgery to place some screws and plates in my leg, I was discharged to recover at home. The next 8 weeks on crutches were tough, but I was just grateful to be alive, broken leg and all. We never did make up for the camping trip, but in the years since, I've taken my kids camping a few times. Thinking about it now, maybe it's time to give my friend a call. We haven't caught up in years, and another camping trip might be just what we need, though I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time.